Before the Age of Empires written in steel and starfire, before humanity claimed the void as its own, the fate of the species was decided not by conquest, but by a quiet, desperate act of collective suicide. On a version of terror that no scholar of the Imperium could ever recognize, a world of raw, untamed psychic energy, humanity was young. Its soul flickered brightly in the Sea of Souls, the great ocean of the Imperium we now call the Warp. But this ocean was changing. It was no longer a realm of tranquil, chaotic potential. It was becoming predatory. The nascent consciousness of humanity, with its burgeoning passions, fears, and dreams, was feeding something immense and terrible in the depths. There were those who could see this change, the first true psychers of the species. They were known as shamans, men and women, who could guide their souls through the tides of the Imperium, who could commune with the formless energies that lay beyond the veil of reality. They saw the gods of chaos taking shape, coalescing from the raw emotion of all sentient life. They felt the first stirrings of Khorne's rage, the subtle caress of Slaanesh's temptations, the festering touch of Nurgle's despair, and the maddening whispers of Tzeentch's ambition. They understood a horrifying truth. The natural psychic evolution of humanity would lead not to enlightenment, but to damnation. Each new human psyker born was another potential doorway for these monstrous entities, another soul to be devoured. Faced with this inevitable extinction of the human soul, they conceived of an impossible gamble. Their own power was considerable but finite. As individuals they would die, and their souls would be consumed by the rising tide like all the others. But together their power could be forged into a weapon, a shield, a singular will strong enough to stand against the coming storm. On the high plains, under a sky that had not yet been choked by industry, they gathered for the last time. Thousands of them, the most powerful psychic minds of their era, prepared for the ultimate ritual. It was not a ritual of summoning or of banishment, but of creation. They would not fight the gods of the Warp. They would create a god for humanity. One by one they ended their physical lives. But their souls did not dissipate. In a blinding vortex of pure psychic energy, their spirits, memories, and immense power were woven together, a torrent of spiritual force, guided by a single desperate purpose: to protect mankind, to guide it to ensure its survival against the eternal enemy they had foreseen. The souls intertwined, shed their individual identities, and forged a new, singular consciousness of unimaginable magnitude. From this psychic crucible, a soul unlike any other was born. It was the fusion of thousands, yet it was one. It possessed their collective wisdom, their combined strength, and their unified purpose. And as this psychic supernova cooled, it settled into the waiting vessel of a single newborn child. The new man. The one who would in a future beyond their comprehension be called Emperor. For millennia this being was a ghost in his own species' history. He walked among mortals, a silent observer cloaked in anonymity. He was a Bronze Age king, a philosopher in a Greek polis, a scientist heralding a new age of reason, a soldier on countless forgotten battlefields. He watched as empires rose from dust and returned to it. He saw humanity reach for the heavens with primitive rockets, and he saw them fall back to Earth in flames and atomic fire. Through the long, brutal march of history, he guided, nudged, and advised, but never ruled. He was patient, a shepherd tending a flock that did not know of his existence. He saw the potential for greatness within them, a burning ambition to conquer and understand, but he also saw their deep-seated flaws, their capacity for self-destruction, the very weaknesses that fed the hungering entities in the Warp. He understood that humanity could not be commanded into greatness. It had to be led there when it was ready, when it had been forged in the crucible of its own history. He was waiting for the precise moment when his intervention would not be seen as tyranny, but as salvation, the moment when humanity, having exhausted all other paths, would be ready to accept the guidance of a shepherd who had watched over them since the dawn of their consciousness. The long watch of the silent shepherd ended in fire and thunder. The age of strife. The long and terrible period history would call Old Night had finally broken humanity. Terra was no longer a cradle, but a charnel house, a global battlefield where techno-barbarian warlords waged perpetual war with arsenals of forgotten, terrifying science. The promise of humanity's psychic evolution had become a curse, with uncontrolled psychers tearing holes in reality, serving as conduits for the very horrors the Emperor was born to fight. The dream of a unified humanity was dead, buried under continents of irradiated ash, and ruled over by tyrants clad in powered armor and ignorance. The time for quiet observation was over. The flock was tearing itself to pieces, and the wolves of the warp were circling ever closer. From the heart of the Himalaysian mountain range, the Emperor emerged. He was no longer a hidden guide. He was a warlord clad in golden armor, his psychic might a blazing sun that banished the shadows. With him came the first of his transhuman warriors, the legions of the Thunder Warriors. They were giants of muscle and fury, genetically engineered for a single purpose, the brutal, violent unification of Terra. They were a necessary atrocity, living weapons forged to fight a war of absolute annihilation against the despots and mutants who had claimed the throne world. The unification wars were not a conflict of negotiation or diplomacy. They were a storm of lightning and blood, a systematic extermination of any power that would not bow to the Emperor's vision. He cast down the warlords, shattered their armies, and broke the back of Old Night with overwhelming, uncompromising force. It was the first and perhaps most honest demonstration of his philosophy for humanity to survive. It first had to be conquered. Once Terra was his, and the first true space marines were being forged in his gene labs, the Emperor unleashed his true weapon, one far more powerful than any legion. He declared the Imperial truth. It was a simple, stark, and revolutionary philosophy for a species steeped in 10,000 years of superstition and fear. It was a declaration of absolute secularism. The Emperor stood before the nascent Imperium and stated with the unimpeachable authority of a living god that there were no gods. There were no benevolent deities in the heavens, no malicious devils in the depths, no spirits, and no magic. The terrors of the warp, he explained, were not demons, but Xenos predators of a different dimension, beings of energy that fed on emotion and could be understood, catalogued, and ultimately defeated through science and reason. The Imperial truth was the foundational ideology of the Great Crusade. It was a command to unchain the human mind from the shackles of faith. Religion was cast as the source of most of humanity's suffering during Old Night, a poison that had turned them against each other and made them vulnerable to the manipulations of the warp. The Emperor's vision was for a galactic empire of logic, a civilization where every action was dictated by empirical evidence and scientific advancement. The mission of the Legions Astartes was not merely to conquer, but to enlighten, to bring the light of reason to the scattered worlds of humanity. They were to tear down the idols of false gods, burn the scriptures of ignorant priests, and dismantle the cults that had festered in the long darkness. The goal was profound and audacious: to starve the chaos gods of their primary source of power worship. By convincing humanity that they did not exist, the Emperor planned to weaken them to the point of impotence, severing their connection to the material universe forever. The future he promised was one where mankind stood alone, master of its own destiny, beholden to no power but its own intellect, and united under the singular rational authority of its Emperor. It was a glorious atheistic dream, the promise that humanity could finally, after millennia of terror, climb out of the darkness and into the pure, cold light of truth. The Imperial truth was a lie. Not a malicious deception, but a necessary one, a cauterizing brand applied to the bleeding soul of humanity. It was a weapon and a shield, but it was not the final objective. While the Great Crusade blazed across the galaxy, bringing 1,000,000 worlds into the light of secular reason, The Emperor was engaged in a secret war for humanity's future, a project so vast and so vital that its existence was concealed even from most of his own sons. Deep beneath the Himalaysian peaks within the inner sanctums of the Imperial Palace, the Emperor's true work was underway. This was his master stroke, the ultimate solution to the problem of chaos. He intended to lead humanity not to victory in the warp, but away from it entirely. He planned an exodus. The genesis of this grand design lay in the ancient ruins and dormant technology of a fallen alien empire. The Eldar, in their arrogance and wisdom, had mastered a form of interstellar travel that rendered the perils of the warp utterly irrelevant. They had built the webway, a labyrinthine dimension existing between real space and the Imperium, a network of stable corridors through which they could traverse the galaxy in perfect safety, shielded from the ravenous entities that swam in the Sea of Souls. The Emperor, in his long life, had studied this ancient creation. He saw in it the ultimate salvation for his species. If humanity could build its own webway, if it could control and navigate this interstitial realm, it would no longer need to risk its ships and souls in the tempestuous currents of the warp. The navigator houses would become obsolete, the Geller fields would be unnecessary, and most importantly, the Chaos Gods would be denied their primary means of interacting with and corrupting mankind. The Emperor's plan was breathtaking in its ambition. He would not simply access the existing Elder webway, he would build a new human extension centered on terror. At the heart of the Imperial Palace, he constructed the Golden Throne, not as the life support engine of a dying god, but as the master control nexus for this new network. It was a psychic amplifier of unimaginable power, a machine that would allow the Emperor's singular will to forge new tunnels through the labyrinth dimension, to seal breaches, and to create a safe harbor for the entire human race. His dream was to bring every human world into this new webway. Humanity would live and travel within its protected confines, evolving and growing in a controlled environment, completely severed from the malign influence of the Chaos Gods. The Imperial truth was merely a temporary measure to keep humanity's soul quiet while he constructed this cosmic nursery. Once the project was complete, humanity could begin its psychic awakening in absolute safety, guided by his hand, free from the threat of demonic possession and spiritual decay. It was the ultimate gambit, a plan to elevate humanity beyond the reach of its greatest predator. Crucial to this monumental undertaking was the Primarch of the Thousand Sons Legion, Magnus the Red. Of all the Emperor's sons, Magnus was the most psychically gifted, his raw power, second only to the Emperor himself. He and his legion of scholar warriors were uniquely suited to understanding the esoteric arts required to navigate and shape the non-reality of the webway. The Emperor brought Magnus into his confidence, sharing with him the glorious secret of the project. Magnus was to be the guardian of the Golden Throne, the eventual master of the human webway, the one who would oversee the final stages of its construction, while the Emperor continued to lead the crusade. But this trust was paired with a stern, absolute command. Magnus was to cease his legion's experimentation with sorcery, with the dangerous trafficking with warp entities that he saw as a mere tool for knowledge. The Emperor knew that such practices were an open invitation to the very powers he sought to escape. It was a command Magnus, in his intellectual arrogance, could not fully obey. And in that disobedience, the dream of a golden age was shattered. When Magnus discovered Horus's impending betrayal, he sought to warn his father. But instead of using conventional astropathic means, which he believed were too slow and might be intercepted, he chose to send a message directly to the Emperor's mind. He gathered the might of his most powerful sorcerers and cast a spell of immense power, a psychic spear aimed at the heart of the Imperium. He tore through the fabric of the Imperium and smashed his way directly into the psychic sanctum of the Imperial Palace. He found his father, but in doing so, he committed a cataclysmic act of destruction. The psychic wards protecting Terra, the intricate and delicate defenses shielding the human entrance to the webway, were breached. The spell did not just carry a message, it punched a gaping, bleeding hole through the barrier between dimensions. In that single desperate act of loyalty, Magnus the Red had destroyed everything. The psychic shockwave of his arrival shattered the Emperor's intricate work, and into the pristine, nascent corridors of the human webway, the demons of the warp came flooding in. The promise of a safe haven became a gateway to hell, right in the heart of the throne world. The demonic invasion of the Terran webway was the death knell of the Emperor's ultimate ambition, but the Horus heresy was the dagger that would pierce his heart. The civil war that tore the fledgling Imperium apart was a tragedy on a galactic scale, a conflict that burned with the fire of betrayed idealism and filial hatred. It culminated in the Siege of Terra, a battle that dwarfed all others in human history, where brother fought brother amidst the ashes of the world they had been created to protect. At the peak of the siege, with the fate of humanity hanging by a thread, the Emperor made his final desperate move. He teleported to the Vengeful Spirit, the flagship of the traitor Warmaster Horus, for a final confrontation that would decide everything. The battle that unfolded on the bridge of that corrupted vessel was not merely a physical contest. It was a war of souls, a psychic apocalypse between a father and his most beloved son. Horus was no longer the noble Primarch he had once been. He was a vessel for the combined power of the Chaos Gods, a being of immense reality-warping strength. He stood over the broken body of Sanguinius, the angelic Primarch of the Blood Angels, who had faced him first and been slain. The air crackled with raw, imperial energy. The Emperor, for all his incalculable power, fought with a heavy heart. He saw in the monster before him the faint, flickering image of the son he had raised, the friend he had trusted, the brilliant commander he had named Warmaster. And in that hesitation, in that flicker of paternal love, lay his doom. He held back. He parried blows that could have shattered continents and weathered psychic assaults that could have extinguished stars, but he did not unleash the full annihilating force of his power. He could not bring himself to utterly destroy his son. He believed even then that Horus could be saved, that the noble soul within could be reached. It was a fatally human miscalculation. Horus, empowered by the merciless gods of chaos, had no such reservations. He struck a series of devastating blows, shattering the Emperor's golden armor, breaking his body, and scourging his soul with psychic fire. The Emperor was laid low, a being of godlike power, brought to the brink of death by his own love and compassion. It was only when a lone custodian, Olanius Persson, sacrificed himself in a futile act of defiance and was obliterated from existence by Horus that the Emperor understood. In that moment of casual, absolute cruelty, he saw that the son he had loved was truly gone, leaving only a monstrous puppet in his place. With a final terrible surge of power and grief, the Emperor gathered his remaining strength and unleashed an attack of pure psychic annihilation. It was a focused blast of soul fire that bypassed Horus's divine shields and burned away the influence of the Chaos Gods, incinerating his very soul. For a single lucid moment before his death, the Warmaster was himself again, and in his eyes the Emperor saw a flicker of regret, a silent plea for forgiveness, before he was utterly erased from reality. But the victory was a hollow one. The Emperor had won, but he was mortally wounded, his body broken beyond any conventional healing, his spirit torn and bleeding. When Rogel Dawn and his imperial fists finally breached the bridge, they found a scene of unimaginable horror, the corpse of one Primarch, the fading essence of another, and their father, the master of mankind, dying. Dawn, ever the pragmatist, made the only choice he could. He carried the shattered body of his father back to the Imperial Palace, back to the one machine that might sustain him. The Golden Throne, the intended heart of the Webway project. The key to humanity's safe future was hastily and brutally repurposed. The Emperor was interred within its arcane mechanisms, the nexus of his shattered consciousness connected to its vast psychic machinery. It was no longer a gateway to a dream. It became a monstrous life support system, a cruel parody of its original intent. The Emperor's dying body became the new heart of the Imperium, his mind a silent lighthouse in the storm. The Great Crusade was over. The imperial truth was forgotten, soon to be replaced by a new fervent religion. The dream of a secular, enlightened humanity safe from the horrors of the warp died that day, entombed with a broken emperor upon a throne of tarnished gold. To understand the shattered psyche of the 41st millennium, we must first return to the simplest, most direct interpretation of the Emperor's will. This is the first and most widely accepted hypothesis among those few radical historians who dare to look past the dogma of the ecclesiarchy, that the Emperor's purpose was exactly what he claimed it to be. He was the godless shepherd, and his sole ambition was to guide humanity into a future free from gods, free from faith, and free from the superstitions that had shackled them for millennia. If this is true, then the current state of the Imperium is not his monument, but his tombstone, an eternal galaxy-spanning testament to his most profound and bitter failure. The proof of this tragedy is written in the story of the son who loved him most and whom he broke for it. Lorga Aurelian, Primarch of the Wordbearers Legion, was a seeker. Cast upon the world of Colchis, a planet steeped in ritual and dominated by a powerful dogmatic faith, Lorga grew to be a preacher of unparalleled charisma. When the Emperor found him, Lorga saw not a man, but the divine figure his old faith had prophesied. He transferred his fervent devotion to his father, believing him to be the one true god of humanity. The Wordbearers became the most zealous of all the legions, their compliance actions not mere conquests but crusades. They raised monumental cathedrals in the Emperor's name, they wrote holy scripture, praising his divinity, and they spread the word of their god-emperor across the stars. They were utterly passionately loyal, and for this the Emperor punished them with absolute, merciless contempt. To him, Lorga's worship was a poison, a regression into the very darkness he sought to eradicate. He ordered the Ultramarines to make an example of Lorga's legion. Their perfect city, Monarchia, a world-spanning monument of devotion built in the Emperor's honor, was razed to the ground. As Lorgar and his entire legion knelt in the ashes, the Emperor publicly shamed and humiliated his son, rebuking him for his faith, and reminding him in the coldest terms that the imperial truth had no room for gods. In that moment, the Emperor, in his unwavering commitment to a secular reality, broke his son's heart and shattered his faith. It was an act of profound cruelty intended to cauterize the wound of religion. Instead, it sent a broken and disillusioned Lorgar searching for new gods for powers that would welcome his devotion. He found them waiting in the warp. It was Lorga who became the first Primarch to fall to chaos, and it was he who authored the Lectitio Divinitatus, a holy text that secretly venerated the Emperor as a god. The supreme irony is that this forbidden book, born from the pain of a son rejected for his faith, would become the foundational text for the imperial creed. The seeds of the ecclesiarchy were sown by the very Primarch who fell to chaos because the Emperor denied his own divinity. Now, 10,000 years later, the Imperium is everything the Emperor fought against. Its halls of power are not laboratories and observatories, but cathedrals and shrines. Its leaders are not scientists and philosophers, but cardinals and confessors. Trillions of citizens live and die by the words of fanatical priests, their lives governed by ritual prayer, and the blind worship of the very being who declared that all worship was ignorance. Every battle is a holy war, every death a sacrifice to the God-Emperor on his golden throne. According to the hypothesis of the godless shepherd, this reality is the greatest blasphemy imaginable. The Emperor is not a silent god enjoying his veneration. He is a prisoner forced to witness his life's work, undone his grand dream of reason, curdling into a nightmare of faith his name invoked to justify the very tyranny of superstition he sought to destroy. His eternal torment is not just physical, but ideological. He is the unwilling god of a church he would have burned to the ground. The second great hypothesis regarding the emperor's purpose looks beyond the political and religious facets of his crusade and into the very soul of the human species. This theory posits that the imperial truth was not the end goal, but a means to an end. The emperor's true overriding objective was to act as a helmsman, a guide for the turbulent and terrifying next stage of human evolution. For humanity, whether it knew it or not, was transforming. It was destined to become a species of psychers, and this metamorphosis, if left untended, would lead to its swift and absolute damnation. This was the ticking clock that drove the emperor's every action. The biological imperative of his race was also its greatest existential threat. The evidence for this evolutionary leap was everywhere a core reason for the collapse of civilization during the Age of Strife. Across the scattered worlds of mankind, the number of individuals born with psychic potential was increasing exponentially. But this was not a blessing. For every psyker who could control their abilities, 1,000 more were ticking time bombs. An untrained, undisciplined mind with a connection to the warp is a dinner bell for the horrors that reside there. They became unwitting conduits for demonic possession, their minds torn apart and their bodies turned into gateways through which the entities of chaos could spill into reality. Worlds were consumed by demonic plagues and mass insanity, all because a single child was born with a gift they could not comprehend or control. The Emperor, being the most powerful human psyker in existence, understood this peril better than anyone. He saw that humanity was on the verge of a psychic dawn, but that this dawn would break upon a slaughterhouse. From this perspective, the Emperor's every major decision can be reinterpreted. He was not a conqueror seeking dominion for its own sake, but a psychic steward attempting to manage an apocalyptic transition. The Great Crusade was not just about reclaiming lost worlds. It was about imposing a strict controlled order upon the human genome to bring all these nascent psychers under his watchful gaze. The imperial truth's militant atheism takes on a new meaning. It was a form of psychic hygiene. By forcing humanity to abandon superstition and emotional worship, he was attempting to lower the overall temperature of the human soul in the warp, to make it less of a blazing beacon for predators. He was calming the waters before attempting to teach his species how to swim. His creation of the Navigators serves as a perfect microcosm of this grander plan. He took human psychers, stabilized their genetic code, and guided their mutation into a specific functional form that could serve the Imperium. The psychic helmsman hypothesis suggests he intended to do this for the entire human race. He would guide the evolution of all mankind, turning them into a species of controlled, disciplined psychers, masters of their own power rather than slaves to it. This is where the Webway project becomes absolutely central. It was not just a transportation network. It was to be the ultimate nursery. Inside the shielded confines of the Webway, humanity could have evolved in complete safety, insulated from the corrupting touch of chaos. The Emperor could have personally overseen this mass apotheosis, nurturing each new generation, teaching them to use their powers, and forging them into a psychic race that could rival the Eldar at their peak. It was a plan of staggering paternalistic foresight. He was not merely shepherding his people. He was attempting to personally midwife the birth of a new, greater humanity. His fall and imprisonment on the Golden Throne represents the ultimate failure of this plan, leaving his children to awaken into their power alone in the dark, surrounded by monsters. A third, more metaphysical hypothesis presents a chilling alternative. It suggests the Emperor was not a naive idealist who failed, but a tragic figure of immense foresight, who understood the fundamental, inescapable laws of the cosmos. This theory posits that the Emperor knew, perhaps from the very beginning, that his destiny was to become a god. His militant secularism was not a rejection of this fate, but a desperate, calculated attempt to control the process of his own birth. He was not a reluctant leader. He was a reluctant god fighting a losing battle against the very nature of reality and the adoration of his own people. To comprehend this idea, one must understand the terrible truth of the Imperium. The warp is not merely another dimension. It is a mirror to the collective soul of all sentient life. The Chaos gods were not born of fire and void, but were given consciousness and power by the coalesced emotions and beliefs of trillions upon trillions of beings over millions of years. Belief is the currency of the warp. Faith has mass. Worship is a creative force of unimaginable power. For 10,000 years, the Imperium of man has directed the most potent, concentrated torrent of faith in galactic history towards a single point of focus, the broken man upon the golden throne. Quadrillions of souls in their moments of terror, hope, and sacrifice have offered up their prayers, their lives, their very spiritual energy to the God Emperor. This is not a passive act. It is a ceaseless, galaxy-wide ritual of deification. This hypothesis argues that this psychic deluge is having a tangible effect. The Emperor, the man, may be little more than a corpse sustained by arcane technology, but in the warp something new is being born from his legend. The God Emperor is taking shape, a nascent psychic entity, coalescing from the faith of mankind, just as Khorne was born from rage and Nurgle from despair. He is becoming the very thing he publicly decried. His miracles, the appearance of the Legion of the Damned, the living saints, the divine light that can incinerate demons, may not be acts of his own conscious will. They may be the first stirrings of this new god, an entity of pure order and faith, taking shape around the martyred soul of its unwilling progenitor. This theory gains a formidable weight when one considers the persistent legends of the Emperor's actions long before the Great Crusade, specifically his fabled journey to the world of Molech. During the Dark Age of technology, it is whispered that the Emperor discovered a gateway into the realm of chaos itself. He stepped through it alone and confronted the four great powers in their own domain. He did not go to destroy them, for he could not. He went to bargain. The legends claim he emerged with a portion of their power, a sliver of their divine knowledge of creation, and the soul, the very knowledge he would later use to engineer his 20 Primarch sons. This act suggests a terrifying level of understanding. To bargain with the gods, one must understand divinity. It implies the Emperor knew millennia before the first bolt gun was fired that the ultimate war for survival would not be fought with ships and armies, but between gods. Perhaps he realized that the only way to truly protect humanity from the pantheon of chaos was to create a new rival god, a god of order of humanity with himself as its avatar. Viewed through this lens, his imperial truth was a masterful, albeit failed, gambit. It was a strategy of controlled apotheosis. By denying his own divinity and enforcing atheism, he was attempting to slow down the process to prevent his transformation from being rushed and shaped by the raw, uncontrolled emotions of his people. He wanted to ascend on his own terms, to become a god of reason and strength, not one of blind, fanatical faith. The Horus heresy and his internment on the Golden Throne shattered this plan. He lost control of the narrative, and the slow, deliberate process he envisioned was replaced by a chaotic 10,000-year flood of worship. He is becoming a god not of his own design, but of humanity's desperate need, a god of hatred, vengeance, and sacrifice, forged in the crucible of a dark and ignorant age. Perhaps the truth is not buried in esoteric prophecies or complex evolutionary theories. Perhaps the truth is simpler, colder, and written plainly in the Emperor's actions from the very beginning. This fourth hypothesis strips away any pretense of benevolence and presents the Emperor not as a savior, but as the ultimate tyrant. He was a being of immense age and power who, after watching humanity for 30,000 years, had come to a single terrible conclusion. His species was fundamentally flawed, a race of self-destructive children who, if left to their own devices, would inevitably lead themselves to ruin. His purpose, therefore, was not to guide or enlighten, but to conquer. He sought to impose a forced salvation to save humanity from itself by shackling it in the unbreakable chains of his own absolute will. The price for survival, he had decided, was freedom. The evidence for this grim interpretation is not found in hidden texts, but in the open record of his conquests. The Unification Wars were not a gentle consolidation. They were a campaign of cultural annihilation. The Emperor did not just defeat the techno-barbarian Lords of Terror. He systematically erased their cultures, their histories, and their identities, replacing them with a single, monolithic Terran state. He saw diversity as a weakness, a source of conflict that had to be purged. His most brutal and telling act was the quiet genocide of his own first soldiers, the Thunder Warriors. After they had won him the world, after they had bled and died to place him on the throne of terror, he had them systematically exterminated. They were flawed tools too unstable and violent for the era of galactic expansion that was to come, so they were discarded like broken blades. This was not the act of a benevolent father. It was the cold calculus of a master who has no sentiment for the instruments he uses. This view of his creations as tools, not sons, extended to the Primarchs themselves. This, the necessary tyrant hypothesis argues, was the true unadorned nature of their relationship and the ultimate source of the Horus heresy. The Emperor did not create 20 sons. He forged 20 living weapons, each one engineered for a specific function in his grand machine of conquest. He never treated them as family. He did not raise them, he did not confide in them, and he did not love them in any recognizable human sense. He saw Angron's rage not as a wound to be healed, but a resource to be exploited. He saw Perturabo's grim determination and assigned him the most thankless and brutal siege warfare, never offering praise, only more impossible tasks. He saw Mortarian's resilience and sent him to the most toxic death worlds. They were cogs in his machine, and when they developed ambitions, resentments, and desires of their own, when the tools began to think, the machine began to break. The Horus heresy was not born of chaos alone. It was born of a father's emotional neglect and a tyrant's cold pragmatism. The Primarchs who turned traitor did so because they felt used, unloved, and ultimately betrayed by a creator who saw them only in terms of their function. In this dark interpretation, the Emperor's entire project was an attempt to build a perfect, orderly, and entirely controlled galactic empire. His goal was absolute domination, for he believed with the certainty of a being who had seen civilizations crumble 1,000 times that anything less would lead to chaos and extinction. The Imperium of the 41st Millennium, in all its oppressive, brutal, and totalitarian glory, is not a perversion of his dream, but its purest and most logical conclusion. There are truths and there are heresies. And then there are ideas so profound, so utterly blasphemous, that they threaten the very foundations of reality itself. The fifth hypothesis of the Emperor's purpose is one such idea. It is a whisper from the darkest corners of lore, a theory that suggests the Emperor was not fighting the gods of chaos, but was on the verge of joining them. It posits that the sheer, unadulterated force of his ambition, his desire for absolute order, his will to dominate all fate and reality was so immense that it was carving out its own space in the immaterium. He was on the path to apotheosis, not as a god of light, but as a fifth chaos god, the Dark King, a god of tyranny and soulless order. This concept did not arise from idle speculation, but from the fevered visions and forbidden texts of the Horus heresy itself. As the war reached its zenith, certain individuals with the sight demons, fallen Primarchs, mad prophets, began to speak of a new power stirring in the warp. It was an echo of the Emperor's own soul. Where Khorne is born of rage and Slaanesh of excess, this nascent power was being born of pure, cold, unrelenting control. It was the god of the perfect silent machine, the deity of the flawlessly executed plan, the patron of the tyrant who believes his cause is just. The prophecies spoke of the terminus, an endpoint for the universe, where all things would fall under a single unblinking eternal will. This was not the chaotic anarchy of the existing pantheon. It was a competing and perhaps even more terrifying form of damnation. The Emperor's actions seen through this dark lens become not a crusade for humanity, but the birthing pangs of a new god. His quest for total domination, his absolute certainty in his own vision, his willingness to sacrifice billions for the sake of his perfect order. These are not the traits of a benevolent shepherd. They are the very qualities from which a god of tyranny would be forged. The hypothesis suggests that his power and ambition had reached a critical mass. He was on the precipice of a terrible apotheosis, a transformation that would have enslaved the entire galaxy in a final, unbreakable peace. The peace of the silent, unthinking cog in a flawless machine. He would have defeated chaos, but only by replacing it with a new and perhaps worse form of cosmic evil. This brings us to the final soul-shattering question posed by this theory, a reinterpretation of the climax of the Horus heresy that turns all accepted dogma on its head. What if in the final moments of the duel aboard the vengeful spirit, Horus Lupercal, vessel of chaos, the arch-traitor saw the truth? What if the Chaos Gods, in their hubris, showed their champion the true prize, not Horus's own ascension, but the birth of his father as their equal and their rival, the Dark King? In this telling, Horus's final moments are not an act of betrayal, but one of horrifying, ultimate loyalty. He saw that his victory would damn his father's soul, and his father's damnation would unmake the universe. So he forces a choice. He makes himself utterly irredeemable. He kills the lone guardsman not out of malice, but to show the Emperor the monster he has become, and the greater monster the Emperor is about to become. He goads his father, forcing him to choose between his love for his son and the fate of reality. He compels the Emperor to unleash the totality of his psychic might, an act of annihilation so complete that it not only destroys Horus, but also shatters the Emperor's own soul and derails his dark apotheosis. Could it be that Horus's final unspoken act was to save his father from himself? This reframes the Emperor's internment on the Golden Throne completely. It is not just a prison of the body, but a prison for the soul. It is an act of eternal self-imposed penance. He sits in torment, broken and silent, not just to power the Astronomicon, but to deliberately starve the nascent god of tyranny within him, to keep the Dark King from ever being born. The master of mankind may be held in place by arcane technology, but also by a single terrifying act of filial love from his most treacherous son. All other hypotheses of shepherds, helmsmen, gods, and tyrants are ultimately rooted in the past, in the grand designs of a being who could still act, plan, and command. But what if all those plans are now just dust, irrelevant echoes of a forgotten dream? A sixth, and perhaps the most grimly pragmatic hypothesis, states that the Emperor's original purpose no longer matters. His true and final purpose is the one he now serves to be the eternal sacrifice, the undying martyr, whose agony is the only thing holding the Imperium of man together. This theory is not concerned with what the Emperor wanted to be, but with what he has by necessity become, the tortured, screaming soul at the heart of a failing machine. His primary function in this living death is to power the Astronomicon. From the Golden Throne, the psychic light of the Emperor's consciousness is focused and projected across the galaxy, a beacon of order in the chaotic madness of the warp. It is the only lighthouse in a sea of nightmares. Every ship that travels between the stars, every transport carrying soldiers to a distant war zone, every vessel bringing vital supplies to a besieged world navigates by this singular light. Without it, interstellar travel would be impossible. The navigators would be blind their third eyes, seeing only an impenetrable storm. The Imperium as a cohesive galactic empire would shatter in an instant. Worlds would be isolated, lost, and left to fend for themselves against the encroaching darkness. Trade would cease, armies would be stranded, and the fragile web of communication that binds humanity would be irrevocably severed. The Emperor's mind is the literal linchpin of civilization. If he were to truly die, if his light were to be extinguished, the age of Imperium would end, and a new, far more terrible old night would begin. This crucial role is sustained at a cost that is beyond all reckoning. The state of the Emperor on the Golden Throne is not one of peaceful slumber or meditative trance. It is a state of perpetual, unimaginable torment. His body is a ruin, a desiccated husk that has not known a moment's peace in 10,000 years, kept from final decay only by the arcane energies of the throne. Yet his mind is not only conscious, it is hyper-aware, fighting a war on a scale that no other being could comprehend. He is the last bastion against the flood. With one part of his consciousness he projects the guiding light of the Astronomicon. With another he holds back the demonic legions that still press against the shattered webway gate beneath his palace, a single will standing against an eternity of hell. And even this titanic effort is not enough. The Golden Throne is failing, and the Emperor's own life force is guttering like a dying flame. To sustain this agony for one more day requires a constant tribute of blood and souls. Every single day, 1,000 human psychers are brought before the Golden Throne. They are connected to the great machine and their life energy. Their very souls are siphoned out of them and fed to the Emperor, a psychic transfusion to keep his mind burning for another 24 hours. They die screaming, their essence consumed in a flash to fuel the Emperor's eternal torment. His original dream may have been to lead humanity into the light. His final inescapable purpose is to serve as a dike of rotting flesh and bone, sustained by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 of his own children, holding back an ocean of damnation with the force of his unending pain. He is no longer a ruler or a father. He is the keystone of an arch of suffering, the living corpse, whose eternal sacrifice is the price for humanity's continued miserable existence. In the endless grinding despair of the 41st millennium, hope is the rarest and most dangerous of commodities. Yet in the deepest shadows and most secret of cabals, one final desperate hypothesis persists. It is less a theory and more a messianic prophecy, a whisper of a future that deviates from the slow decay towards oblivion. This is the theory of the Star Child. It posits that the Emperor is not merely a broken body or a nascent god of order, but a fractured soul, and that the best part of him, his humanity, escaped the moment of his fall and is waiting to be reborn. The foundation of this belief lies in the shattering trauma of the Emperor's duel with Horus. When the War Master struck him down, the damage was not just physical, but spiritual. His soul, a vessel of unimaginable psychic power, was broken. A part of that soul, the cold, calculating, godlike intellect of the Master of Mankind, was interred on the Golden Throne, where it continues its eternal war. But the theory goes another piece was shorn away in that moment of agony and paternal grief. The part of him that was still human, the part that had loved his sons and hesitated to strike the final blow. The core of compassion that was the legacy of the ancient shamans was split off. This shard of pure, uncorrupted human spirit, a concentration of all that was once noble in him, fled the ruin of his body and escaped into the warp. This psychic remnant is the Star Child. It is not a being of immense power like the entity on the throne, but something different, a nascent gestating soul of pure potential, a divine infant adrift in the sea of souls. It is the ghost of the Emperor's lost humanity waiting for a chance to return to the mortal world. According to the prophecy, this can only happen when the galaxy is at its darkest and a suitable mortal vessel is prepared. If the Star Child can be drawn from the warp and into a new body, the Emperor will be reborn, not as a distant tyrannical god, but as a new savior, a Messiah who can walk among his people and lead them into a true golden age. The followers of this creed, known as the Illuminati, believe this is the only true hope for mankind's salvation. The Illuminati are a secret society composed of some of the rarest individuals in the galaxy, men and women who have been possessed by demons and have through sheer force of will cast the creatures out, surviving the ordeal with their sanity intact. They believe this harrowing experience has purged them, granting them a unique clarity and immunity to the whispers of chaos. They see themselves as the secret guardians of humanity's future, working from the shadows to manipulate events and prepare the way for the Star Child's advent. They seek to create the perfect host, a new sensei, an immortal son of the Emperor who can house the divine soul and bring about the prophesied second coming. But in a galaxy defined by its grim reality, is this not the most dangerous hope of all? Is the Star Child a genuine promise of redemption, or is it merely the ultimate lie, a cruel and intricate deception crafted by the chaos god of plots, Tziench, to manipulate the most dedicated of his foes? The very idea of a gentle, benevolent savior returning to a universe of unending war seems like a child's fantasy. The Illuminati, for all their conviction, could be nothing more than deluded puppets, their great and secret work, serving the agenda of a power they cannot comprehend. The Star Child theory represents the last glimmer of light in an encroaching darkness. It is the belief that the Emperor's original dream of a better future for humanity was not entirely extinguished on the vengeful spirit, but it is a faith that stands in defiance of every observable truth of the 41st millennium, a fragile hope that is almost certainly just another path to damnation. All these competing truths, from the most pragmatic to the most mystical orbit, a single unknowable object, the Golden Throne itself. For 10,000 years it has been the silent, brooding heart of the Imperium. But it is not a static monument. It is a dynamic, failing, and terrifyingly mysterious engine that raises the ultimate question for humanity's future. Is this arcane machine merely a prison, a life support system prolonging an ancient agony, or has it become something else entirely over the long millennia, a chrysalis, a divine cocoon within which a new and terrible form of life is gestating? The most immediate and terrifying truth comes from the one organization entrusted with its care, the Adeptus Mechanicus. In the most secret data canticles accessible only to the highest echelons of the Martian priesthood, the admission is stark and absolute. They no longer understand how the Golden Throne works. It is a relic of the dark age of technology, a machine of such complexity that its workings are now indistinguishable from sorcery. Their maintenance is no longer science but ritual. They anoint its circuits with sacred oils and chant litanies of activation to appease its machine spirit, but they cannot truly repair its ancient failing systems. And it is failing. Components are breaking down at a molecular level, arcane subsystems are flickering and dying, and the immense power required to keep it functioning is becoming ever more unstable. The tech priests work frantically, their every effort a desperate attempt to delay an inevitable, catastrophic system failure. They know with a cold certainty that borders on religious terror that a day is coming when all their rituals and patch repairs will not be enough. The Golden Throne will die, and with it the light of the Astronomicon will be extinguished. The demonic hordes will finally break through into the heart of terror, and the fragile existence of the Imperium will end. The question of the Emperor's purpose becomes secondary to this apocalyptic timetable. The clock is ticking, and the master of mankind is entombed within a dying machine that no one knows how to save. This impending doom forces a more profound and disturbing question. What is the effect of 10 millennia of this torturous symbiosis having on the Emperor himself? He is a being of unimaginable psychic potential, interred in a psychic amplifier and force-fed a constant diet of 1,000 souls a day, while simultaneously being bathed in the worship of quadrillions. This is not a static state of being. It is a process, a metamorphic transformation of terrifying proportions. The Golden Throne, therefore, may not just be a prison cell, it may be an incubator. Is the man who was the Emperor even still there? Or has his original consciousness been dissolved, boiled away by 10,000 years of pain and praise, becoming the nutrient fluid for something else? Like a caterpillar in a chrysalis, its old form breaking down to provide the raw material for the new. Perhaps the Emperor is being unmade and remade into something truly divine and truly alien. The torrent of faith from his worshippers is not just sustaining him, it is shaping him. They pray to a vengeful, hateful god of mankind, and so within the golden shell is a vengeful, hateful god taking shape. The question then becomes not if he will die, but what will happen if he is reborn. Should the Golden Throne finally fail, will it release the broken corpse of a man? Or will it crack open like an egg, unleashing a fully formed god upon a terrified and unprepared galaxy? A god born of pain and sustained by sacrifice, a being who may no longer see humanity as children to be protected, but as fuel to be consumed in its cosmic war against the ruinous powers. The greatest hope of the Imperium, his return may in fact be its final and most absolute damnation. The greatest conflict in the 41st millennium may not be the endless war against the Xenos and the heretic, but the silent internal war between the Emperor's true entombed will and the monstrous state that has been built in his name. The Imperium claims to act according to his divine purpose, yet its every function, its every belief seems to stand in stark opposition to the vision he championed. This schism is not just a matter of historical debate. It is a living contradiction, a tension that plays out in miraculous phenomena and is embodied in the tragic figure of the last loyal son to have known the man before the myth. Across 1,000 battlefields, when all hope is lost and the line is about to break, they sometimes appear. Wreathed in ethereal fire, their black armor adorned with symbols of bone and flame, the Legion of the Damned materializes from nowhere. They do not speak. They do not accept orders. They fight with the cold, silent fury of vengeful ghosts, turning the tide of a hopeless battle before vanishing as mysteriously as they arrived. Who are they? The ecclesiarchy calls them an expression of the God Emperor's divine wrath, but they operate outside any chain of command, their purpose seemingly to save the common soldiers of the Imperium, not to uphold the authority of its priests and lords. These and other miracles like the angelic living saints seem to be flickers of a consciousness at work, a protective instinct that cares for the people of the Imperium, not its dogmatic institutions. It suggests a vast and impassable gulf between the silent, suffering mind on the throne and the loud, tyrannical, and fanatically religious state that claims to be its voice. Nowhere is this contradiction felt more keenly or tragically than in the resurrected mind of the Primarch Rabute Guilliman. For 10 millennia he slumbered in stasis, a living memory of the Great Crusade and the imperial truth. When he was reborn into the darkness of the 41st millennium, he expected to find an Imperium struggling perhaps, but still recognizable. What he found was a nightmare. He awoke to a galaxy-spanning theocracy built on the worship of his father, the man who had humbled his brother Lorga for the crime of faith. He, a being of logic, strategy, and reason, found himself surrounded by a civilization that had turned technological maintenance into religious ritual and scientific inquiry into heresy. His shock and horror are the ultimate indictment of the modern Imperium. He walks the halls of the imperial palace not as a returning hero, but as a ghost in a foreign land. He sees the endless groveling masses, the fat, corrupt cardinals preaching hatred in his father's name, the grotesque cherubs and skull-adorned iconography that have replaced the clean aquila of his time. He remembers the Emperor's dream of an enlightened scientific humanity and sees in its place a rotting empire of fear, ignorance, and blind fanatical devotion. This is the core of his tragedy. He has returned to save the Imperium. But the Imperium he must save is the single greatest blasphemy against his father's life's work. Every order he gives, every fleet he commands, every political compromise he makes is an act of profound hypocrisy. He is forced to work with the ecclesiarchy, the very institution the emperor would have dismantled. He must tolerate the worship of his father as a god, a lie that he knows was the seed of the Horus heresy itself. Robuta Guilliman, the avenging son, is a prisoner of this contradiction. He is fighting to preserve a system he fundamentally despises, propping up a corrupt theocracy in the hope that he can steer it away from the abyss. He is the last voice of the Emperor's original dream, forced to speak the language of the Imperium's dogmatic nightmare in order to be heard at all. His return has not healed the Imperium's soul. It has only given that tormented soul a conscious, grieving mind. For 10,000 years, the return of the Emperor has been the ultimate prayer of a dying Imperium. It is the final, desperate hope, whispered in the trenches and chanted in the cathedrals, that one day the master of mankind will rise from his golden throne whole and hale and lead his people into a final victorious crusade. But this fervent prayer is born of ignorance and fear, for it never dares to ask the most crucial and terrifying question: who or what would actually come back? The greatest hope of the Imperium may in fact be its final and most terrible threat. Consider the first scenario, that by some impossible miracle of technology or faith, the man himself is restored. The Emperor of the Great Crusade, the secular warlord of reason, steps down from the Golden Throne. The initial reaction would be a wave of religious ecstasy that would shake the galaxy to its foundations. The god of their prayers would be made flesh, but that joy would turn to terror in an instant. This emperor would not see a faithful, pious Imperium deserving of reward. He would see a grotesque, ignorant, and corrupt theocracy built upon the abandonment of his every principle. He would see the superstitious dogma of the ecclesiarchy, the shadowy paranoia of the Inquisition, the technological stagnation of the Martian priesthood, and he would be filled with a cold, righteous fury. His first act would not be to lead a crusade against the Xenos, but to wage war on his own empire. He would declare the imperial creed a heresy. He would order the ecclesiarchy dismantled, its corrupt cardinals executed as traitors to his truth. He would demand an end to the worship, the superstition, the very faith that has sustained his people through the long night. The result would be the second great imperial civil war, a conflict that would make the Horus heresy pale in comparison. It would be a war of faith against the very object of that faith, a crusade of believers against their own returned, unbelieving God. The Emperor would be forced to unleash a purge of unimaginable scale, to burn down the rotten structure of his own Imperium in order to rebuild it from the ashes. This salvation would be a baptism of fire, a cleansing that would cost trillions of lives and might shatter humanity permanently. The second scenario is even more terrifying. What if the being that returns is not the man, but the god? What if 10,000 years of torment, sacrifice, and worship have completed the metamorphosis within the golden chrysalis? The being that emerges from the throne would not be human. It would be a true entity of the warp, a god of order, whose mind operates on a cosmic scale. It would not see men, but souls. It would not see worlds, but strategic assets in the great game against chaos. Its concerns would be as far beyond human comprehension as a man's are to the bacteria on his skin. This awakened god might no longer care for quaint notions like freedom, compassion, or even human life beyond its utility as a resource. It might see the flaws and chaotic emotions of humanity not as something to be guided, but as a weakness to be purged. Its return could herald an age of absolute, soulless compliance. It might rewrite the human genome, extinguishing emotion and free will to create a perfect psychic race of drones for its eternal war. It might demand sacrifices that make the daily toll of 1,000 psychers seem merciful. This being would save humanity from chaos, but only by unmaking it, by transforming it into something that is no longer human at all. The price of victory against the demons of the warp might be the loss of the very soul they sought to corrupt. In either scenario, the return of the Emperor would be an apocalypse. The Imperium prays for a savior, but the only beings that could emerge from that throne are a wrathful Puritan or an alien god. His continued silence, his eternal agonizing martyrdom, may be a far greater blessing than the terrible answer to their prayers. In the final analysis, the search for a single true purpose for the Emperor may be a futile one. His story is not a simple narrative of success or failure, but a grand, overarching tragedy defined by a series of cascading, soul-crushing paradoxes. The very fabric of the Imperium and the Emperor's role within it are woven from these profound and bitter ironies, each one a testament to a dream that was twisted into a nightmare by the cruel realities of the galaxy. First and most glaring is the paradox of the savior who became the object of damnation. The Emperor strode into the galaxy as a champion of reason, a figure who declared war on the very concept of divinity. His foundational principle was that gods were a poison and faith was a chain. He humbled his own son for the crime of worship and burned worlds to extinguish the light of belief. And yet his legacy is a galactic theocracy that dwarfs any religion in human history. His name is the foundation of the most powerful and oppressive church the galaxy has ever known. He sought to free humanity from the tyranny of gods, only to become the most tyrannical god of all his silent agony, the focus of the very superstition he gave his life to destroy. Second is the paradox of the father who was destroyed by his own children. The Emperor engineered his 20 Primarch sons as the pinnacle of genetic science, beings of immense power and intellect, created for the sole purpose of uniting humanity and leading it into a golden age. They were his instruments of order, his greatest hope for the future. And it was they, his most perfect creations, who brought about the ultimate ruin. The Horus Heresy was not a war against an external foe. It was a civil war of brothers, a family tragedy that burned a chasm across the galaxy. The instruments of unification became the agents of division, and the sons created to build his dream were the very ones who tore it down and left it in ashes. And finally, there is the ultimate paradox that encompasses all others, the Seeker of Order, who fathered an age of unparalleled chaos. Every action the Emperor took from his first conquests on Terra to the final battle aboard the Vengeful Spirit was aimed at a single goal, the imposition of a lasting, rational order upon a hostile universe. His entire existence was a war against chaos in all its forms. Yet the direct and undeniable result of his life's work has been the Imperium of the 41st Millennium, 10,000 years of the most brutal, ceaseless and chaotic warfare the galaxy has ever witnessed. His quest for a perfect enlightened empire did not avert the darkness. It plunged humanity directly into its heart and gave it a reason to fight, to die, and to hate for millennia to come. His grand design for a peaceful, unified humanity resulted in its eternal bloody damnation. So what was the Emperor's true purpose? To stand at the end of this labyrinth of theories, of heresies, and forgotten histories is to be faced with the unsettling truth that there may not be a single answer. The reality is likely a tragic mosaic of them all. Perhaps he began as the godless shepherd, a rationalist with a noble dream of an enlightened humanity, only to find himself forced into the role of a necessary tyrant to control a species he deemed too flawed to save itself. Perhaps his ambition to be the psychic helmsman guiding his race's evolution set him on an unforeseen path to becoming a reluctant god, his own power and humanity's belief threatening to transform him into a being he would have despised. And perhaps in the crucible of the heresy, he stood upon the precipice of becoming the Dark King, the ultimate tyrant, and was only saved from that damnation by an unthinkable act of sacrifice, leaving him as the broken, eternal sacrifice upon a throne of pain. The truth is likely a story of a grand vision colliding with a cruel and unforgiving universe. He was a being of unimaginable foresight who failed to see the simple human flaws in his own perfect sons. He was a master of science and reason who could not account for the irreducible, irrational power of faith. He was a shepherd who, in his haste to protect his flock, became a wolf. Every theory contains a piece of this shattered mirror, and to gaze into any single one is to see a reflection of the whole tragic epic. The Emperor's purpose was likely not one thing, but a constantly shifting goal, a series of desperate gambles made by a being trying to steer the ship of humanity through a storm that was in the end too powerful to overcome. Ultimately, the question itself may have become meaningless. 10,000 years of war and decay have rendered his original intentions little more than a ghost, a historical footnote in a story that has long since spiraled out of his control. The more important, more immediate question is not what was the Emperor's purpose, but rather what has humanity done with his legacy? And the answer to that is all around us. It is in the crumbling Gothic spires of a billion shrine worlds. It is in the fear-filled eyes of a guardsman facing unnameable horrors on a forgotten planet. It is in the chanted litanies of a priest who preaches hatred and intolerance in the name of a being who championed reason. The Emperor's legacy is the Imperium. It is a vast, rotting and oppressive empire, a civilization teetering on the brink of collapse, held together by fear, faith, and the fragile, flickering light of a dying man's mind. It is a candle in a hurricane, a single point of defiant, miserable order in a galaxy of ravenous chaos, and its only fuel is the endless sacrifice of human lives. This is the final terrible truth. The dream of the Emperor, whatever it may have been, is dead. All that remains is the machinery of survival, a brutal, grinding engine that consumes hope and churns out martyrs. The figure on the golden throne is no longer a father, a savior, or a king. He is a symbol of the ultimate price of existence in a hostile cosmos. His original purpose lies buried, lost forever beneath 10 millennia of war, dogma, and despair, interred in the same cold silence as the last forgotten hope of mankind.